For 3 years, Maria had worked for James Harrison, one of New York's most successful tech entrepreneurs. To the outside world, he was the brilliant mind behind a revolutionary software company, a man whose net worth exceeded most people's wildest dreams. To Maria, he was simply Mr. Harrison, polite, distant, and perpetually absorbed in his work. She cleaned his 12-room penthouse 6 days a week, moving through the space like a ghost, careful never to disturb the carefully curated silence he seemed to prefer. What Mr. Harrison didn't know was that Maria had been fighting a private war for the past 8 months. Her daughter, Sophie, had been diagnosed with leukemia just after her 7th birthday. The medical bills had consumed everything, their savings, Maria's retirement fund, even the small inheritance her mother had left her. Her husband, Carlos, worked 2 jobs, driving a cab during the day and doing security work at night, but it still wasn't enough. The experimental treatment Sophie needed wasn't covered by their insurance, and they were drowning in debt, choosing between medication and meals, between hope and hunger. So Maria had developed a system. After Mr. Harrison finished his catered dinners, elaborate meals, he barely touched. She would carefully pack the leftovers. Not for herself, though she often went hungry. These meals went home to Sophie and Carlos, providing the nutrition her family desperately needed while she stretched their grocery budget to cover Sophie's prescriptions. It was survival, not stealing, she told herself. Mr. Harrison would only throw the food away. But now, caught in the act, shame burned through her body like acid. "Mr. Harrison, Her voice cracked and she couldn't continue. The container slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble countertop. James Harrison stepped into the kitchen, and for the first time in 3 years, he really looked at Maria, not past her, not through her, but at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform hung loose on her frame, the desperate exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked quietly. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay you back, I promise. I'll work extra hours. Please don't fire me. I need this job. My daughter, she's sick, and we can't afford—" The words tumbled out in a torrent of panic and desperation. "Your daughter is sick?" James interrupted, his voice softer now. "What's wrong with her?" And so, standing in that gleaming kitchen, Maria told him everything. She told him about Sophie's diagnosis, about the failed chemotherapy treatments, about the experimental program at Memorial Sloan, Kettering that could save her life but cost more than Maria would earn in 5 years. She told him about Carlos working himself to exhaustion, about choosing which utilities to pay each month, about lying awake at night wondering if her daughter would see her 8th birthday. She told him things she'd never told anyone, because in that moment she had nothing left to lose. James listened without interrupting, and as Maria's story unfolded, something cracked open inside him. He'd been so consumed by his own world, board meetings, product launches, profit margins, that he'd forgotten what it meant to truly see another person. His own childhood had been one of privilege, his path smoothed by family money and elite connections. He'd never had to choose between feeding his family and saving a child's life. When Maria finally fell silent, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, James did something that surprised them both. He pulled out a chair and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. "Maria, you should have told me," he said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. "You work in my home. You take care of my space. And I didn't even know your daughter's name." Over the next hour, they talked like 2 human beings rather than employer and employee. James learned that Sophie loved to draw, that she dreamed of becoming an artist, that she still smiled despite everything she'd endured. Maria learned that James had lost his younger sister to cancer when he was 17, that he'd built his fortune partly to outrun the helplessness he'd felt watching her fade away. When Maria finally left that night, it was with a promise from James that left her dizzy with disbelief. He would cover Sophie's treatment, all of it. The experimental therapy, the hospital stays, the medication, everything. Maria had refused at first, her pride warring with her desperation. But James had been insistent. "Let me do this," he'd said. "Let me turn my sister's death into something meaningful." But James didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, he visited Sophie in the hospital, bringing sketchbooks and colored pencils, sitting with her during the long treatment sessions when Maria had to work. He established a fund at the hospital to help other families facing similar crises. He started really seeing the people who worked for him, not just Maria, but his driver, his assistant, the doorman, the delivery workers. He learned their names, their stories, their struggles. Sophie's treatment was grueling, but it worked. 6 months later, she was in remission. The first picture she drew after returning home was of a man in a business suit with angel wings, which made James laugh until tears ran down his face. Maria framed it and hung it in the penthouse with his permission, a reminder of the moment compassion had changed everything. The story could have ended there, a neat tale of generosity rewarded. But life is rarely that simple. 2 years later, James faced a hostile takeover of his company. He fought to maintain control, but the battle left him financially devastated. As he sat in his attorney's office, signing away most of his assets, he felt the walls closing in. That evening, he returned to a penthouse that would soon belong to someone else. Maria met him at the door, her eyes knowing. Without a word, she handed him an envelope. Inside was a check, not for the full amount he'd spent on Sophie's treatment, but for everything Maria and Carlos had managed to save over 2 years of overtime and sacrifice. It wasn't nearly enough to solve his problems, but it wasn't the money that made James's throat tighten with emotion. It was the note attached. You taught us that wealth isn't measured in dollars. Sophie is thriving. Carlos got promoted. I'm taking night classes to become a nurse. You gave us our future. Now let us help build yours. With love and gratitude, the Rodriguez family. That night, surrounded by packing boxes, James realized he'd spent the first 40 years of his life accumulating wealth, but missing the point entirely. Real richness wasn't in his bank account or his penthouse view. It was in the connections he'd made, the lives he'd touched, the moment he'd chosen compassion over indifference. James rebuilt his career, starting smaller but wiser. Maria stayed with him, though now as his friend rather than just his employee. Sophie grew up to become an artist whose work explored themes of resilience and hope. And every year on the anniversary of that night in the kitchen, they gathered for dinner, always with enough leftovers to share, always with gratitude for the hunger that had brought them together, and the humanity that had fed them all.